Which tune am I tapping on this cup? If you're sitting there thinking, happy birthday to you, you would be correct. That short little exercise is what Adam Grant talks about in this book in terms of the difficulties originals face in getting their ideas across. Original thinkers, innovators, people with new ideas can struggle in their respective fields and domains because people will not necessarily understand what they are talking about. They might be so immersed in the old way of doing things, the current way of doing things, the status quo, that they simply are not really sure what you're talking about and are not really willing to hear you out or give you credit, particularly if you are somebody without a track record or without someone who's built up what he calls status, respect within the organisation for being creditable and reliable. But this book by Adam Grant is all about how contrarians can triumph, and it contains lots of stories about sports people, speech writers, innovators, particularly in the tech industry, entrepreneurs, lots of success stories of how people have overcome and defied gravity. And this book will help you to succeed in counteracting groupthink, for example. One of the last chapters in this book is about how organisations can counter groupthink and some of the policies and procedures they can put in place to ensure that dissenters and those with different opinions from perhaps the leaders of the organisation can be heard, and for that information to be fed into the system as a whole, and for the organisation to benefit from the diversity of experience, knowledge, understanding, perspectives, etc. So this is a wonderful read. It's very densely packed with lots of stories, and fundamentally there are some big takeaways which one can learn and use in real life. So for example, when looking at success stories across time, he noticed that creatives like Shakespeare, Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Thomas Edison, contrary to popular belief that one should always prioritize quality over quantity, he argues in the book that sometimes in order to find a prince, one might need to kiss many frogs. In other words, those particular individuals I just named, Bach, for example, wrote over 1,000 pieces of music. So it's more likely that practice makes perfect. And, Malcolm Gladwell's famous 10,000 hour rule, which is to say that it takes, according to him, around 10,000 hours to master a particular discipline. And from the people that Adam Grant studied, this seems to ring true. It's also the case that if one writes a huge volume of books, of plays, of patents, lots of technological innovations, and in the case of the composers, pieces of music, it's more likely that just by chance, 5% of those works are going to be genius. They're going to be considered classic pieces that broke, that were groundbreaking, and rule changing, and in some sense developed the domain that they happen to be working within and progressed it, because he argues throughout this book that originals are people who ultimately improve the world, because they have to fight against dogma, they have to fight against the authoritarian trends and proclivity and tendency of systems to be top heavy, and for the people at the top to not be willing to listen to people at the bottom. But the people at the bottom need to persevere, they need to be persistent. He gives the reader a number of tips of how one can be more strategic in overcoming some of the obstacles to getting your ideas across. He talks about how procrastination, once again, contrary to popular belief, is actually quite important, and that one needs time to daydream and to switch off and to allow for time and space in between starting a particular task and completing it. The time in the middle, in between the start and the finish, is extremely important. It's important to place that activity and the subject matter on the back burner, to allow your subconscious to chew it over and to question it, to criticise it, to play with it, and allow for your creativity to unfold. It's extremely important to allow the process to take place, including lots of procrastination. So it was a wonderful read. There's one particular chapter about how being a younger sibling can actually have advantages. He talks about how there seems to be statistical evidence to suggest that if you happen to be the youngest in perhaps, a family of 4 children, you're more likely to be a rule breaker. And Adam Grant suggests that this might be in part because the role of parents in setting strict boundaries is simply weaker for the youngest children, partly because perhaps parents rely on the older brother or the older sister to supervise and watch over the younger children. So there is some data. He looked at comedians, for example, in the book, and he suggests that comedians have the attributes of originals in that they question the status quo, and part of being funny is to question convention and expectations. And there's some evidence to suggest that he looked at the top 100 comedians, and a large percentage of them were in fact the youngest sibling in their family. And so there is some statistical data to back up his points. One of the last things I'll leave you with in this short video is a question. Why was it that users of Google Chrome and Safari performed better in their job, were happier in their job, and stayed in their job longer in a particular study than those who used Internet Explorer and Safari? Take some time to think about that. Why did users of Firefox and Google Chrome perform better on a number of measures in their work performance than those who used Internet Explorer and Safari as their internet browser? What Adam Grant discovered was that it wasn't to do with the browser itself. There wasn't hardly any difference between the browsers. There wasn't one that gave a technical advantage, for example. What he has suggested is that the reason why those who were using Google Chrome and Firefox performed better across the board in a number of areas was indicative, it was reflective of their more proactive mindset. Because they took the trouble to not accept the defaults, but to change their browser, to think outside the box, to think to themselves, is there a better way of doing this? And to take ownership of their work environment meant that they were also more likely to find creative ways to enjoy their jobs more than simply following the script, and they were more engaged in their work. So that was an interesting study which Alan Grant talks about in this book. So, fantastic book. I would give this certainly at least an 8 out of 10 for quality and for value. Anyone who reads this is definitely going to learn a lot, and there's a lot of useful, valuable information in here. Do go and check it out. Thank you very much.